Welcome. It's nice to see a good turnout for our session on amazing Zeppelin stories. And I understand we have some people also dialing in on Zoom, one so far. Well, maybe we'll pick up a few more. Unfortunately, they couldn't participate in the drawing for the book in German. Anyhow, so I'm going to start this off by talking about something near and dear to my heart, having to do with a little piece of history. People often ask me, how did you possibly get into this collecting of Zeppelins and other philatelic items? And I think my wife asked me that about once a week when she's looking for more room in the house to move me out of. So we thought we'd put together something a little bit interesting about lesser known things. So I'm going to start off by talking about some issues with respect to the U.S. Zeppelins. Cheryl Gons is going to, Jim Hill's going to follow, talking about the officers of the Graf Zeppelin, and Cheryl Gons is then going to finish off on how to drop mail from the Zeppelin. And you'll see in my presentation, we didn't know how to do it in the U.S. Navy. So I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So again, in terms of, I want to take a couple seconds and talk about, first of all, why the title. So I will apologize in advance for the somewhat provocative title. Those of you who know me know I tend to be a little bit flip and irreverent, and so unfortunately I can't leave that behind. So I want to talk about what could have been an attack of the U.S. Navy Zeppelin USS Macon on Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was aboard the USS Houston at the time, really 1,200 miles from almost anywhere, either Hawaii, San Francisco, or farther from San Francisco, or Clipperton Island, which was the last stop before the USS Houston made its way to Hawaii. To me, this has been a very interesting collecting area. If I do answer my wife about why I collect these things, it usually has to do with my interest in history. I'm an academic, although I am an engineer, but I've always had a soft spot in my heart for historical items, and this really crosses over a number of historical issues. One, of course, is just Zeppelins, and we're all here, so we must love those mysterious airships. Interesting part of Zeppelin history. It's also an interesting part to me of presidential history, given that FDR had the propensity to take 1 month a year, hop onto the USS Houston with, of course, one or two other ships in the presidential squadron and take a, quote, fishing vacation. I can't imagine what would happen today. And I don't care if it was Trump, Obama, Biden, anyone, and they did that. Now, interestingly enough, if I have the time, it turns out that that was actually a very cost-effective way in 1934 to visit Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Colombia, which the ship actually did visit, compared today of jumping on Air Force One. I don't know if anybody, I've had this conversation with a few people, how many, or anybody know how much an Air Force One costs, the new one? They're building two, Boeing's building two. How about $2 billion a piece? So even if you look at the inflated cost of the Houston and other things here, that's quite a bit more money today than it cost in those days. So interesting presidential history. And then finally, although not so much a topic of this conference, the USS Macon was a naval vessel, and so there's quite a lot of naval history associated with this. And so it's really been fun to put together Zeppelin's presidential history and naval history kind of all in one place in this presentation. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this. That must be the... Let's try that. That doesn't do this. You would think the one with the where on button would work. So I have a feeling I will be better off to just do this, but that's not going to work either. So the expert is here. Sure, you're going to give me an extra couple minutes, right? Good. Thank you so much. So I have way more material than I can possibly cover in the 30 minutes I have. And so I'm going to sort of start at the end in a way and make sure we do spend some time talking about some of the more interesting activities. Before I do that, what we're going to talk about here is really crammed into a very small period of time. I put together a little timeline that actually goes all the way back to FDR's inauguration, the christening of the Macon, and the crash of the action. The items that are the most interest for this particular purpose are highlighted in red. And it was pretty well known that FDR was going to be taking a trip for the month of July on the USS Houston, going from Annapolis all the way down into the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, onto a couple of islands in the Pacific, the Cocos Island and Clipperton, and then make his way to Hawaii and then to Portland. So the trip was pretty well comprehended. The rough dates of arrival and departure were pretty well comprehended, but anything about the details of the timing, of course, was kept fairly close to the vest for obvious security reasons. However, Admiral King was really looking for a way to get the Macon in the press, and boy, did he succeed. In fact, sidebar, if you're interested in this material, actually my exhibit's right across the way. There's about a half a frame of material on this particular flight. I really highly recommend this book about, Wiley was a lieutenant commander in those days. Ernie Marshall's done just a fantastic job of putting together a history of Wiley's life, including this particular activity. So highly recommended. I think I have the reference on the first page of the exhibit. So if you don't have to write that down, you can just wander over there and get that. The other great book is Cheryl's book on Zeppelins. And she does have a copy of this letter, June 18th. Where Admiral King suggested to Wiley that wouldn't it be great if he figured out a way to intercept the Houston out in the middle of the Pacific. Although the letter suggests that, it's not completely clear to me that King actually knew that Wiley was going to still do this or not. So Cheryl and I can argue about that later on. But in any case, that was June 18th, and realizing that the Houston and FDR were going to be leaving just a couple weeks later from Annapolis. In fact, Wiley didn't even take command of the Macon until July 11th, and it was only the Macon's second flight under Wiley's command that they made a quote-unquote protracted flight to sea on July 18th. At least that's what he told the folks up in his chain of command that he was doing. He didn't mention anything about, well, let's see, maybe the Houston's out there and we're going to try to find it. In fact, they weren't too happy about that after the fact, and we'll come back to that. In fact, the feat of intercepting the Houston way out in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean, with the Macon coming from Moffett Field out through San Francisco, the probability, in my view, of them finding the Houston was pretty minimal, given the navigation tools that they had in those days. But in fact, they were successful. They steamed. Macons don't steam. At least that one didn't. They flew directly south, trying to intercept the path. They actually turned at a point where they thought they would be behind the Houston, and then sent these small planes that they carry ahead to see if they couldn't intercept it. And lo and behold, that happened. Interesting story. There was a deck officer of the deck was changing on the Houston, and luckily there was one person on board who had been a naval aviator, because when they saw these two small FC-9s, the planes that the Macon carried, coming out of the clouds, they had an extra fuel tank. And the one gentleman who had no clue about any of these planes thought that they were being attacked by some force, and that fuel tank was actually a bomb. And his colleague looked over and said, no, I know what those are. Those are FC-9s, that must be the Macon. And so he guessed it before the Macon made it out of the clouds. So to me, this is just a remarkable feat of navigation, I guess, especially given that the Macon had been through bad weather on the trip and really had a tough time putting themselves in the path of the Houston to make this happen. Now, one of the reasons that this is such an interesting philatelic topic is shown in this slide. Both of these covers are in my exhibit. There were 16 of them. Actually, Cheryl's exhibit, which is right across from us, also has one. I don't think I've been to any exhibits in the last 10 years where there are three of these covers represented. There were 16, and we certainly don't know where they all are. We can probably account for what, Cheryl, maybe 10 of them the most at this particular point in time. These were all postmarked at Moffett Field just about the time, just before the Macon took off on July 18th to try to make the intercept. And they were carried on board along with a number of newspapers and other items that the hope was to be able to drop these to the Houston when they made the intercept. A couple of interesting things about these. I'll actually come back to the right one if we have time a little bit later on. But the one on the left, the top left is the front of the cover. You see again, I'll call it common, July 18th postmark. It has kind of a double cachet, one that's printed, talking about at least the hope that on July 19th they would be able to intercept the Houston. And then it doesn't show up particularly well on the screen, but those Zeppelins are actually metallic. In fact, you can see those very nicely in both of the exhibits. The covers were dropped not from the Macon, but from the small FC-9 aircraft that were basically the aircraft offloaded from the Macon in the air and were able to fly 2 bags of mail toward the Houston. Unfortunately, both of the bags missed and landed in the ocean. Luckily, they were in watertight pouches, and the Houston was able to send launches out to pick them up. The mail clerk on the Houston then added these July 19th presidential cruise cancels, and all of the covers were signed by FDR and also by the Macon commander, Herbert Wiley. I show the back of the large size cover because this one was actually addressed to Eleanor Roosevelt back at the White House and was part of the president's collection. And one way you can figure that out is, I don't think you can probably read it from back there, but after he passed away, this particular cover was sold through the Gimbel's department store in New York and has the stamp from Gimbel's there in, I think that's 1946. Some of the other covers I will show actually were sold through H.R. Harmer, which handled a number of the materials from FDR's collection as well. Cheryl and I have been arguing over this one a little bit in terms of who knew about this drop and who didn't. It was clear that the Macon officers knew about it, or the drop, knew about the plan for this intercept. It was very clear that the chain of command did not know, because following along with the Houston was the USS New Orleans with all the news reporters. About a microsecond later, they had typed up their stories and they were waiting in a queue to be radioed back home. And the chain of command, pretty much up through the whole Navy, let's just say, wasn't particularly happy with not the fact that Wiley did this, but the fact that they had no clue where the Macon was going to be and that it was even going to be close to the Houston. So I think somewhere in the smoke-filled room, Admiral King, maybe with a little support from FDR, called them off, and Wiley got his promotion to commander after all the next year. So in terms of philatelic interest, There's any number of event covers associated with this. I'll show a few of those if time permits. But the majority of the history of this whole trip for FDR is captured in covers that were mailed from the USS Houston. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I have Houston or the other ships that were tagging along. So, of course, they wouldn't let the president out to sea on a single vessel, the Houston. So at least for the Atlantic, they had two destroyers as part of what was called the Presidential Squadron, the USS Gilman and Williamson. I must say, in looking for mail from the two destroyers, it's particularly hard to come by for this trip. There's lots of mail from Houston, so I'm always on the lookout for mail from the Williamson or the Gilman. A couple covers, and again, basically the point of these covers is it really tracks the progress of the Presidential Squadron starting out on July 1st, and it's interesting. It says Annapolis first day. Of course, that's not a first day cover, but it is the first day of the cruise, and that was the intent for that particular postmark. I like this one in particular. It was postmarked in San Juan, Puerto Rico on the 6th. The Houston went all the way south around Florida, stopped in the Bahamas for some fishing for the president. That's a cover from Williamson, the USS Williamson, that very familiar, at least to some of us, that Hutnick put together with this red and blue addresses. And then this one from San Juan, Puerto Rico, that was actually mailed to a friend of the president's in New York, and of course he signed it before it went out. So I was very pleased to be able to come up with that cover. So early July, the president started out. If you kind of want to get a feel for this, you can read this faster than I can probably speak to it. Interesting thing about the Houston from the perspective of at least airmail, although I don't think they actually ever did any catapult mail. The Houston was carried float planes, and they carried 4 of those with 2 catapults. And so they had the ability to basically do some lookout activities for the Houston as it was traveling along. I can't say that FDR's accommodations were particularly palatial, but I think compared to even the CO of the Houston, having more than 1 or 2 rooms on board ship was a pretty unusual. And so that top right photo is just a shot of President's quarters. And then one of the stops was in Haiti. You can't actually see the president. If you get out a magnifying glass, you can make him out sitting in his chair on the presidential barge as they're landing in Haiti. I'm not going to go through any detail on a lot of these. I guess I would point out a couple of these covers, one from the Houston and one from the Williamson, were indeed a part of the president's collection. And you can see that Hutnick with this red and blue lettering, it's addressed to the president back in Washington, D.C. And on the reverse of both of those is a stamp from H.R. Harmer when these covers were sold at auction after the president passed. A couple of covers from Columbia, from 2 of my favorite cachet makers, Edward Hacker and Julius Holf. And just as a note for something I'm going to talk about in a minute, this one, Holf addressed it to himself at the Historic Aeronautical Association in Southern California, which was actually his organization, or one of his organizations down there. I guess as a sidebar, in terms of historical context, I love collecting press photos that go with my cover collection. I don't show any of the reverse sides of these press photos, but they all have the copy that they suggest that you use with dates, names, times, and everything you ever wanted to know about it. So if you find these press photos, you've got all that information, and you can see the president standing there with the presidential party. including some Navy officers, some people from the president's family as well. Okay, let's moving right along here. Meanwhile, back at the ranch at Moffett Field, Wiley, if you think about the dates, the president left July 1st, was making his way down through the Caribbean to the Panama Canal, and Wiley didn't take command of Macon until July 11th. So the president was already well on his way on this trip. He made one flight. I guess I don't have a cover from that. This cover was, there's a huge number of Macon covers commemorating the change of command on July 11th. Interestingly enough, there are very few covers canceled July 18th at Moffett Field that weren't later overprinted with some statement about the intercept. So although there are a number of this particular cover from the Oakland Alameda Chamber of Commerce, a number of the other cachet makers got their covers back and they printed another stamp on top of it, you know, announcing the intercept of the Houston by the Macon. Again, as I said, I tend to be a little bit flip at times. So in terms of the Macon attempting to make this intercept with the Houston without orders to do so, if anybody's a military person in here, you know that that's almost instant death. So I talk about the code conspirators, which started out with Admiral King, who I think was Wiley's savior, Wiley himself, the XO, which was Kenworthy, and a couple of others, including Scott Peck, who was the navigator and who put the Macon within 20 miles of the Houston when they crossed paths over a 1,200-mile trip. And of course, the Houston's moving along at the same time. As an engineer thinking about winds and currents and whatnot, remarkable. It's particularly also remarkable that they made the intercept. Well, they started off the morning of the 18th. They made the intercept the next day at about 10 o'clock in the morning. You might say, well, that's a little more than 24 hours. The Macon's top speed was about 75, I'll use miles an hour. And it's almost impossible until you remember there's a 3-hour time difference between Moffett Field and Hawaii, and where they made the intercept, and the trade winds happen to be going southwest. So they gained a good 20, 30 miles an hour average. There turned out to be some fairly strong winds. They didn't have a whole lot of time to be able to do this and do it successfully. Now, Wiley's out was, since he hadn't gotten permission of the chain of command, if we don't succeed, we made our protracted flight to sea and tested things and did whatever, and it was very successful. Nobody would have been the wiser. So, let's see. I have what, 5 more minutes, something like that?
Like 6 or 7.
Okay. I have some other photographs. Again,
That was a ship or a sailboat?
the Houston was a ship, the cruiser. The Macon was a Zeppelin, and it was a Zeppelin indeed. It used the same type of design that the German ships had used. So, in fact, I had already mentioned this. This is another July 18th event cover for the Macon that Sussman made, but you can't read the fine print here, but they overprinted it later on, announcing that yes, indeed, the Macon had intercepted the Houston 1,200 miles from the start point. Okay, I show this kind of for fun. When the president went on these cruises, there was a book that was prepared by the Houston personnel that went through a narrative, all of the things that the president did. And I have a copy of the book for this particular flight. And I think you can probably read that fairly well. It's remarkable to me, the prose that they came up with, although this is actually incorrect. It's interesting to me. So I am going to read it. Out of a dark, cloudy sky, the giant dirigible Macon suddenly appeared. having wireless a short time previous for the Houston's position. That is wrong, by the way. It did not do that. It found the Houston all by itself. Launched the 2 airplanes. These are the 2 FC-9s. Planes, wingspan about as long as the width of this room, very small biplanes that they could get on the Houston. They circled around like charmed birds and dove low over the forecastle to drop recent edition of West Coast newspapers and the covers, which it was later disclosed were dispatched especially for the president. They did get this right. Papers hit the water and were retrieved by powerboats launches from the Houston itself. So Cheryl's going to tell us how the hell you don't do that in the next presentation. And actually, the first sighting was the officer of the deck actually saw the 2 planes. The Houston was still in the clouds. And given the Houston was about 50% larger than, or the Macon was 50% larger than Houston, this was quite an impressive sight, the Macon coming out of the clouds for the folks on the Houston to be able to see. Okay, back to I guess from the perspective of this meeting, the drop covers, which are the most interesting. So I talked a little bit about that larger size cover that was addressed to Eleanor Roosevelt. If you look at this one carefully, you'll see that the envelope itself is actually addressed to the cachet maker Julius Hulf on one of his envelopes. And so it seems like there's a possibility that Hulf may have been giving advance notice from some of the crew members. I think particularly this pilot, Miller, who was one of the pilots of the FC-9s. And there is some thinking that they knew each other and that maybe that information was leaked so that Hulf got one of his covers into the package that was dropped to the president. Very similar to the other cover, Wiley and the president signed it. It has a silver Zeppelin overprint on top. Front side, back side, and this one especially because the overprint, the Houston Cancel didn't take on the silver. You see the nice July 19th presidential cruise USS Houston cancellation. This cover I got along with the transmittal letter from Miller to Julius Hulf. And if you look at it carefully, this is actually just dated, the letter December 1935. So that was almost 2 years later. Miller carried this thing around for 2 years before he got it back to Julius Hulf. The other interesting thing to me, of course, that date, the Macon had already crashed in February of 1935, and Miller was reassigned as a float plane pilot to the USS Northampton, which is similar to the Houston in terms of cruiser. Always find it interesting, the back of this cover has been also signed by Miller, attesting to the provenance that it was really dropped. If you look carefully, in fact, you can tell, he signed it, H.B. Miller, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. That cover was obviously signed on the back many years later after Miller had retired. And it's not too hard to tell if you look at the quality of the writing here when Miller was probably in his 30s compared to what happens to all of us as we get a little bit older. That writing is a little shakier when he indeed signed it on the back. So I have some other materials I'm happy to go over with you as well in terms of some other covers that are associated with both the Macon and the Houston. I guess I would like to leave you with one thought about the U.S. airships. If I look at the list of all the officers and some of the crew that were on these ships, and then we think about this is kind of the mid-30s, we're going into World War II. Almost all of these guys ended up as heroes in World War II, including Wiley. This is kind of one of my favorite photographs of Wiley. This was not a press photo, maybe for obvious reasons. It was late 1944. he had been promoted. He was captain at that time of the USS West Virginia. And in fact, he was relieved of that command just before the West Virginia sailed into Tokyo Bay at the end of World War II. So if you're interested in this kind of history, especially Ernie's book on Wiley is just a real statement to the fact that these guys were true American heroes. And you can tell that Wiley definitely was a risk taker based on some of the things that he did. And in fact, I think it's remarkable. He must have known some people in high places that kept him from having a career that got really sidetracked based on bending the rules just a little bit, maybe too much. So I guess with that, maybe there's time for just one or two questions.
I have one.
Sure.
In Mitchell catalog, sometimes issued a catalog on Zeppelins.
Mhm.
I think it was in English.
There is an English, the new edition's in German again, of course.
At that time, I had a cover from I think it was from South America to New York and Liverpool and Italy. I think it was. And I sent a scan of the cover to Mitchell, and the lady asked me and told me what was the flight number, how much was, because they had an incoming line,
Yes.
and then another city, and she gave me all the details. Did they have that service with Mitchell?
I don't know.
If you have it, it's very convenient. You
Anybody
send a
else know
scan
this
of
one?
the cover, and you have to find it, if you have the English catalog, it's better.
I'm going to guess the answer is probably no, given the
Very,
amount
very
of time you've
helpful.
been in, but that's a guess.
I've never written with Mickle, so I use the catalog myself, but I've never written to them. So.
Interestingly enough, that catalog has a small section on the making.
No, the 2003 was all in English. And then they printed another one that has airmail and Zeppelin. It says
Yes,
in German.
The Zeppelin
But the 2003 was in English.
nickel catalog, both the English edition
I
and
had
the
it for a
German
long
edition.
time.
They,
Then I sold my Zeppelin collection.
They have a short list of phone covers. Of course, Cheryl's book is by far much more complete, but
You can still buy that catalog.
these drop covers are
in
listed.
eBay, or they'll come
Sure.
with the 2003 English Zeppelin catalog.
And one,
In the back.
Yeah, if I get this straight, Lieutenant Miller committed postal theft. And
Especially given the election is on. Never mind.
okay, Jim, management.
Jim, so